There are figures who grow so large in collective memory that it becomes hard to find the human being behind them. People remember the voice, the gestures, the millions who followed them, but lose sight of the young person they once were, the losses that shaped them, the questions that took years to answer, the fear they had to walk through before they could say anything meaningful to the world. Karol Wojtyła was born in Wadowice, Poland, in 1920. He was not born at the center of history. He was born in a small city, in a family that grief slowly emptied out. Before he became John Paul II, he was a boy who learned very early that life can take everything from you, and that even so, there is something that holds. His mother died when he was a child. His older brother Edmund, a doctor, died of scarlet fever when Karol was a teenager. And his father, the only one left, died in 1941, in the middle of the Nazi occupation, while Karol was living through the first years of a war that had erased free Poland from the map. Those three deaths are not minor biographical details. They are the ground on which everything else was built. Broken, fragile ground that forced that young man to ask questions with no easy answers. What remains when everything you love is gone? Where do you put the pain when there is nowhere to put it? What does it mean to keep living with purpose when the world you knew no longer exists? Karol did not answer those questions by closing himself off. He answered them by opening inward and outward at the same time. As a young man, he was drawn to theater, poetry, literature, and philosophy. He was not someone with a decorative faith. He was someone who took words seriously, who understood that language can name what hurts and also what waits. In Krakow, before the war interrupted everything, he took part in literary circles, wrote, acted. There was an artistic sensitivity in him that did not disappear when he put on a cassock. On the contrary, it stayed with him for the rest of his life, and gave his way of speaking about faith a particular quality. Grounded, embodied, capable of reaching very different kinds of people. The war came in 1939. Germany invaded Poland, and everyday life stopped being what it had been. The Nazi occupation shut down universities, persecuted intellectuals, imposed forced labor. Karol worked in a quarry, and later in a chemical factory. It was hard, physical, anonymous work. It was not the path he had imagined. But during that time of darkness, something was growing inside him that no one could see from the outside. A vocation. Not as a sudden revelation, but as a certainty that matured slowly. Between stone and cold and the silence of the dead, he kept accumulating. When he understood clearly that he wanted to become a priest, the path was not straightforward. The Nazis had banned seminaries. Studying for the priesthood in occupied Poland was clandestine and dangerous. Karol did it anyway. He was trained in secret, under the protection of Cardinal Sapieha in Krakow, alongside other young men who also chose that path at the worst possible moment. There is something deeply meaningful in that. His vocation was not born out of comfort or prestige. It was born out of risk, out of an inner conviction that did not give way to external fear. He was ordained a priest in 1946, the year after the war ended. Poland had survived, but barely. And Karol Wojtyła began his ministry in a country that was wounded to the core. What followed was not an ordinary rise through the ranks. It was a path of concrete service. As a young priest, he worked with university students, with young people who were also trying to rebuild an identity in a Poland that was now falling under Soviet communist rule. That new system also wanted to control religious life, limit the church's influence, domesticate faith, or make it disappear. Wojtyła understood early on that defending religious freedom meant defending human dignity, not as a political position, but as a spiritual and human conviction. Every person has an interior life that no government can legislate away. He was named Auxiliary Bishop of Krakow in 1958, Archbishop in 1964, and Cardinal in 1967. He took an active role in the Second Vatican Council, that enormous event in church life which sought to help the Church engage with the contemporary world without losing its identity. Wojtyła was not a spectator. He contributed to the debate with a voice formed by philosophy, by direct pastoral experience, and by the knowledge of what it costs to live by faith under pressure. He was a bishop who knew firsthand what it meant to believe in a context that penalized it. On October 16, 1978, the conclave elected Karol Wojtyła as pope. He was 58 years old. He was the first non-Italian pope in more than 4 centuries, the first from Eastern Europe, the first to come from a country where the Church existed under surveillance and restriction. When he appeared on the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica and spoke in Italian with a slight Slavic accent, something shifted in the air, not only in Rome, in Poland, in the Soviet bloc countries, in many parts of the world where people knew what it meant to live without freedom. He took the name John Paul II, honoring his 2 immediate predecessors, and began a pontificate that no one could yet imagine how far it would reach. His apostolic journeys became one of the defining marks of his papacy. He traveled to more than 100 countries. He was not traveling for institutional appearances. He traveled because he believed the Church cannot stay enclosed within itself, that faith takes root in specific peoples, in different cultures, in particular wounds. Every trip was an encounter, with persecuted communities, with young people without a horizon, with peoples marked by poverty or violence or abandonment. His ability to be present in a way that people felt as real, not ceremonial, was extraordinary. With young people, he had something that was hard to explain rationally. He did not speak to them the way you speak to an audience. He spoke to them as someone who had also been young in a difficult time, and who knew that stage of life carries enormous questions that deserve more than small answers. The World Youth Days he championed brought millions of young people together in cities across the globe. They were not just massive events. They were gatherings where that generation, with all its doubts and searches, was taken seriously. His most widely known call, the one that echoed in so many languages and so many mouths, was direct. Do not be afraid. Not as an empty phrase, but as an invitation to live from faith rather than from fear of making mistakes or getting lost. On May 13, 1981, while crossing St. Peter's Square in the Popomobile, Mehmet Ali Aka shot him. The bullets wounded him seriously. He survived, after a long surgery and a recovery that took months. What he did afterward is one of the most remembered gestures of his papacy. He visited in prison the man who had tried to kill him, and he forgave him. Not as a media gesture, as a concrete act of faith in what he preached. John Paul II had a deep Marian devotion, and on that date, May 13th, the Church celebrates the apparition of Our Lady of Fatima. That coincidence became part of his spiritual interpretation of what had happened. He carried it as something intimate, not as a point of argument. His episcopal motto was totus tuus, entirely yours, an expression of that Marian consecration that ran through his entire spiritual life. It was not a ceremonial detail. It was the summary of an interior attitude. Total surrender, without reservation, as a response to the faith he had received. In his final years, Parkinson's disease progressed, and his body gradually lost agility, voice, and control. Many believed he should step down. He chose to stay, and his public fragility became, without being staged as a spectacle, part of his witness. He showed that human dignity does not depend on health or the ability to communicate with eloquence, that a person can continue to be a witness even when the body fails. That, too, was a message, perhaps one of the quietest and deepest of his entire pontificate. He died in Rome on April 2nd, 2005. St. Peter's Square and the surrounding streets filled with people who had come from everywhere. Among the crowd, there were many young people. He was canonized in 2014 by Pope Francis, in a ceremony that gathered an enormous number of pilgrims from around the world. The question that runs through his life is not abstract. It is very concrete. What does a person do with pain when there is no way to avoid it? Karol Wojtyła lost his family as a young man, lived through a war, studied in secret, governed under pressure, survived an assassination attempt, and grew ill in front of the world. He did not grow hard. He did not close himself off. He did not use suffering to justify distance or cynicism. He walked through it, made sense of it, and turned it into a capacity to accompany others. That is what remains when you look at his life without the noise of monumentality. A man who learned to keep walking under a great deal of weight, and who used that weight to draw closer, not to pull away. The holiness he lived was public and intense, but it was born from something no one could see. Hours of prayer, difficult decisions made in silence, an interior life that held everything else together. John Paul II was not a statue. He was a pilgrim, someone who left a small city in Poland carrying his dead, his faith, his love of words, and a trust that no bullet and no illness ever managed to break. He walked through the whole world, and in every place he left the same open question. If this man, with everything he went through, kept choosing to love, what excuse does any of us have to stop trying?